we see the establishment denigrating the theory of creation. Talk a little bit about the theory of creation in the scientific context.
Yeah, so we can delve into physics and establish that God exists, and this is wonderful science. Are you able to hear me now clearly?
Yes, please.
Okay, so mankind has always been able to generate energy, heat from matter. We've been able to go from matter to energy throughout the history of mankind. For example, burning a log, you get heat. But going the other direction, going from energy to matter, seemed a scrambled egg scenario for mankind. So in the back ages, mankind just opted for, well, then God did it, according to as it's written. But as mankind drifted away from the notion of God and did not want God in their paradigm, then they figured if we can determine how matter came about through natural processes, then we can remove God altogether. Like this was the final straw to say God did not exist. So in the 60s, Dr. Higgs postulated that if we collide energy at the speed of light, we'll get matter. But we didn't have the means or the resources to carry this out. Not until recently, when a collective of humanity across the globe got together and they built the CERN Large Hadron Collider. It's a particle accelerator. And there was over 10,000 scientists and engineers that got together and they built the CERN Large Hadron Collider. The magnets involved to accelerate the particles are 100,000 times more powerful than Earth's gravitational pull on a per-scale basis. And the resources involved tens of billions of dollars, computer facilities that are huge warehouses to analyze the data. And just to operate the facility for 1 month is equivalent to fuel 300,000 homes for an entire year of electrical power. So with all this knowledge and all this resources and all this power, how much matter were they able to convert from energy? And the answer is 125 giga-electron volts per c squared. Now, most people don't know what that is in grams or how to comprehend that in the lay term. So what you do is you take a grain of sand. Here's the amount that they generated. They take a grain of sand and multiply that by 1 times 10 to the negative 19th power. So that's 0.000 for 19 zeros, 1 times a grain of sand. That's how small, minuscule amount of matter they form. Now here's the implications. To then account for all the sand granules on the Earth, all the mass of the Earth, all the mass of the solar system, all the mass of the galaxy, all the mass in the universe, you would seemingly need infinite knowledge, resources, and power. In mankind's attempt to establish there was no need for God, unwittingly they proved that only through God can account for all the matter in the universe.
No, I mean it's a fascinating experiment, and of course, as a compendium to that, I think it should be pointed out that after almost 2 centuries of research into fossils and into every imaginable permutation of trying to prove the theory of evolution, and there are huge libraries filled with books that have theories and articles and whatnot. It has never been proven species can evolve into a superior species, and that is what the theory of evolution is. Instead they now try to replace that with the claim that minor adaptations within a species proves evolution, but it doesn't. All it proves is adaptation. In other words, there's a reason why some people have darker skin than others. That's because they adapted to different climates and environments so that they could protect themselves. There's nothing to do with them evolving or becoming superior to someone else unless you're racist. I mean, it's simply we're all the same human beings. We may be fatter or we may have gotten fatter and stronger because we've harnessed the forces of science, which is God's creation, but we are still the same. and we are all created equal. And
that's correct.
Yeah.
There's no dispute in adaptation, speciation, microevolution. No one disputes that. We observe that, but we see that there's limitations to how far a life can adapt. And the end point is illustrated with when something is so mutated that it's born stillborn, or born sterile, or born deformed. And the reality is, when you follow natural selection is a beautiful thing, and it actually supports creation and debunks evolution. And the reason for it is natural selection conserves the DNA code. It doesn't create DNA code. And here's the logical process. When a creature is mutated, it's weaker and frail and sterile or stillborn. It's prone to sickness. It's prone to disease. So if the climate doesn't kill off the mutated, and the predators don't kill off all the mutated because those are now slower and weaker and smaller creatures, well, then when it's time for procreating, the opposite sex is programmed by their DNA to choose the most genetically accurate copy, to choose the supreme genetic copy, not to choose the frail, not to choose the weak, the sick, the diseased, the deformed, and so forth. So natural selection is actually in the column of creation, not in the column of evolution at all. It's not even close.
Right, and also I think it was Harvard evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most respected Darwinists of the 20th century, who pointed out that the idea that mutations would result in an evolution was preposterous, that the mutated, mutations actually are less likely to reproduce, and that there's also no proof that that reproduction between two superior members of a species has resulted in a superior offspring. I mean, we all know examples of where that's been proven to be not true. So, this whole idea is one that's on the face of it preposterous, which brings me to, well, before we get to a question about that, I want to ask you about the old Earth, young Earth theory. I don't necessarily, I'm not a theologian, and I know you are, but I don't necessarily see a contradiction in the idea that the Earth itself, the physical Earth, is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old. And I don't see how that would contradict necessarily the book of Genesis, which basically holds that man was created in how they describe the seventh day, however that came about. But talk a little bit about that and how it is that we can date the age of the Earth. I know that is carbon dating still the current means of doing so?
Sure. So this is really important. So there's two topics to discern to get to the one answer, and one is going through Scripture, and the other is going through science, and they actually have the same outcome. So going through Scripture, the word day in Genesis, yom, it actually does mean both eons or an indeterminate amount of ages and a rotation of the earth. So how does one discern between the two? And how they discern between the two is this, and it's really simple. But when there's no defining term next to yom, day, when there's no associated term, such as, for example, in the day of the Lord, so there's no defining term with the word yom and day there, then it's any day. It could be eons, all right? But in Genesis, for each day of the Genesis creation account, the word yom has associated term, and it's a number. First day, second day. Each time in the Bible, 100% of the time, when there's a number associated to yom, it defines the day as one rotation of the earth. So Genesis has a defining term, and God wasn't done. He doesn't increase in knowledge, so he knew we would be struggling at this. So there's another defining term, an associated term to yom, today, to help define it, to force it. And it's the phrase, and there was evening and there was morning, the X number of days. So each day has the phrase, and there was evening and there was morning, and a number. And this is where the definitive article the is forced onto the day. So it's the first day, the second day, and so on and so forth for each day. So Scripture defines Scripture. So far, Genesis is forcing how we should interpret Yom in Genesis. But in Exodus, in the Ten Commandments, God wrote in his own hand and testified to what he saw and did on his own. He said, mankind shall work 6 days and rest the seventh, for I made everything, the heavens and the earth, and everything that's in them in 6 days and rested the seventh. And in Deuteronomy 4:32, he says, on the day that I created Adam. So Scripture, defining Scripture, it draws the conclusion of the definite article, the first day, the second day, for Yom. So from science, carbon dating, it's not that the calculations are in error. It's that what was the amount of radioactive carbon to start with in that creature when it died? And here's the point. So 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 5, it says the earth was made from water and through water. And in Genesis 1, verse 2, it already has water existing before the universe was violently expanded on the second day. So you have water everywhere around the celestial bodies. And so NASA has figured out, have you ever been in a pool and you notice that your lower extremities deeper in the water are less tanned than closer to the surface or above the water? Well, we have figured out that water filters cosmic energy, UV rays and that sort of thing. And it does filter visible light, but just not to the same degree. So water's a good filter, a good shield against harmful UV rays. So on the second day of creation, you have, before the expansion, at the end of the first day, you have water existing throughout the celestial body, tightly compact, not the size of a singularity, such as a dot, as Big Bang theorists would hypothesize. Otherwise, water couldn't exist. It would be vaporized from the heat and pressure. So you have a dense universe, densely packed. So potentially maybe the volume of 100 galaxies worth or 1,000 galaxies worth, we don't know. But on the second day of creation, God violently expanded the universe, and that's the Hebrew word rakia. Its root is raka, which means violence, like a blacksmith would pound out sheets of thin metal. You have molten metal, you have sparks, you have steam, you have violence, you have passion. That's the inference in rakia of the firmament expanse used on the second day of creation. And we see that in the remnant cosmic radiation left over that we're able to see across the universe, the cosmos. So the Bible corroborates what science has found. So on the second day of creation, when God violently expands the universe, there's a process in physics called cavitation. Cavitation is when water is highly pressurized so that gas is trapped in solution. And then there's a sudden reduction of pressure so that the gas comes out of solution. We see this every time we open a new soda bottle and the bubbles appear, right? And we read about this. Go ahead.
No, please, continue.
Okay, so we read about this in scuba divers. When they come up too fast, they get what's called the bend, and their blood boils, not from heat, just a sudden reduction of pressure. So with the water surrounding the earth that was pressurized, suddenly undergoing a sudden reduction of pressure because of the violent expansion of the universe is no longer applying a weight and pressure on that water, you're going to get cavitation, and that's God separating the waters from the waters, and that's the creation of the atmosphere. So you have the waters below the atmosphere forming the seas, not oceans, and waters above the atmosphere forming a canopy. Now this canopy would want to come down because of Earth's gravitational pull. But there's no heat up in space because the sun has been expanded away. There's no more pressure to keep it liquefied from heat, from pressure. So this canopy froze spherically around the Earth allowing light through, but shielding the Earth from harmful UV rays, harmful cosmic energy. This shielding prevents cosmic energy from converting nitrogen diatoms to radioactive carbon-14. So creatures that lived on the Earth prior to the flood, prior to this canopy coming down, they would have had trace amounts of carbon-14. So when they die, and we study them today, they would have started at their death with trace amounts of carbon-14. They wouldn't have gone through half-life decays of reducing from a full concentration down to zero. So right now our atmosphere is adding 20 pounds of gas, radioactive carbon-14 each year. And so when you go back in time, the atmosphere was less radioactive carbon until prior to the flood, there was just trace. And that's why carbon-14 dating is flawed. It's the original amount of what the decedent had of carbon-14 when they died. Does that make sense?
Yes, and also, is there any other means of dating the Earth and life on Earth other than the carbon dating system?
Yes. So what scientists do, so this is not science versus the Bible. Science and the Bible are in complete harmony. This is science in the Bible versus the opinions of evolutionary scientists, in case in point. So you ask an atheist or a theistic evolutionist, how do they explain a universe that's 100 billion light years across and only 16 billion years old? And their answer would be to go after Alan Guth, physicist. He postulated a concept called universal inflation. And what universal inflation is at the time of the Big Bang, this would be equivalent to the violent expansion of the universe on the second day of creation for creationists. When the time of the Big Bang, the universe expanded faster than the speed of light. This is called universal inflation. But Dr. Alan Guth postulated that the duration of this accelerated expansion lasted only a Planck time. Now, a Planck time is fractions of seconds. So the duration of a Planck time is a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a millionth of a second. So a very brief amount of time. So that's how they explain a universe 100 billion light years across from edge to edge in only 16 billion years. When you ask a creationist the same question, a creationist can default to the same Dr. Alan Guth universal inflation postulate. But the duration would not be a Planck time, but would be potentially hours. And so therefore a young earth creationist, going according to Scripture, can use science to support a Genesis creation account.
Now, I've also read that the phenomenon of Noah's flood is something that's been corroborated by peoples around the world. I mean, there was in China, they found a cave which showed a depiction of an event that was similar to Noah's flood, and the Hopi tribe of Native Americans have a Noah's flood story, and they all seem to be part of oral history around the world that this event occurred. And also there's some scientific evidence of it. Like, for example, there are marine fossils found at the very top of the Rocky Mountains in the United States. How did they get there? So talk a little bit about that event and what happened there.
Yeah, so that was a very chaotic, violent event. It was not calm waters. The flood was violent and chaotic. And what most people miss is Genesis 7:11 talks about the fountains of the deep burst open. That's biblical terminology for violent force. So deep underwater caverns, freshwater caverns, burst violently, potentially through fault lines that we see today. In my book, Origins, The Origin of Matter, Space, Time, and Life, I postulated that asteroids commenced the Genesis global flood by fracturing the tectonic plates. So what we've learned about tectonic plates is when they are stuck, when they don't move, they build up potential energy. And the violence of when the kinetic energy is released is proportionate to how long the potential energy was allowed to build up. So the longer that two tectonic plates are fixed together, building up energy, the greater the kinetic force released on the other end, and the faster the plates released. So Dr. Walt Brown wrote in his book, Genesis, and I think he's onto a great point, and Kent Hovind goes along with this as well, that when the Genesis flood started to occur, those 1,650 years from creation to the flood of built-up potential energy in the tectonic plates released violently as asteroids fractured the crust of the Earth and allowed those plates to move. Now, friction resists the rate of plate movements. And with all those tectonic plates resting on hot reservoir of deep cavernous water, that would reduce the friction and allow them to hydroplane, as Dr. Walt Brown uses that term, and move quickly. So right now, we look at the rate of velocity of the tectonic plates, and they're moving at a fingernail growth pace across the globe. But when plates are fixed and then they release, we see instances today where tectonic plates can move 40 feet in seconds. So this theory is in accord that plates can move rather quickly, and it would take the violent force to raise up the mountains. And that's in Psalm 104, where God is talking about the flood, and he says he caused the mountains to rise and the valleys to sink down. That's fast tectonic plate movement. So
wow.
You can look at the geological column. This is really fascinating. So when an evolutionist would look at the geological column, they dig into the layers of the crust and they see creatures fossilized in each layer. And they say, oh, well, then as you dig down deeper, you're going through in lockstep with evolution. Well, here's how a creationist would handle that. And it's very simple. But during the flood, the waters were not clear. They were mixed with all the different sediment types. And all the different sediment type would sink according to their density and form smooth, segregated layers in the crust. And not to mention a process called liquefaction. Liquefaction is when there's vibrations, such as from earthquakes, tectonic plate movement, earthquakes, and don't forget to understand that there was a global flood twice daily that swept across the globe during this event, because the tide still continued. That would free up static friction and allow sediment to further segregate according to its kind. So when you look at the layers of the crust, you'll see a layer of clay, a layer of limestone, a layer of mud without biomass, a layer of mud with biomass, and a layer of sand, and so forth. So evolutionists have to accept that for 1 million years or so, only clay deposited, and in 1 million years, only mud without biomass, and then 1 million years of only mud with biomass. Do you see the problem with that? Where
right.
a creationist would just say they all settled according to their density and were further segregated by the liquefaction process. So now how do we get all the creatures in each layer? Now this is fascinating. So imagine all the dead creatures as debris in the water. But even though they're dead, inside of them would still be living bacteria in their intestines, a natural thing for digestive purposes. Well, the bacteria is still living, so they'll consume the flesh from the inside out a little bit. And bacteria have to defecate what they eat, and they defecate methane gas. So we've all watched a CSI show. We've all heard of the guy who murders someone, throws him at the bottom of the lake, and then what happens 4 or 5 days later to that dead person? They rise to the surface because they distended, they bloated, and they changed their density and became buoyant. And that was from the methane gas, from the bacteria still living in them. So all these dead creatures, dinosaurs, triceratops, whatever you want to name, in the water dead, and the bacteria is going to work, and it's changing their density. Now, the rate of resistance to this bloating would be dependent on their DNA that created their external shells and exoskeleton. So creatures that had a shell would be the most resistant to this bloating, and creatures that had an exoskeleton and then creatures that had a thick scale and then a thick fur, you can see them settling at different rates because of their exterior that resisted bloating at varying rates. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how a creationist explains the different fossils at different layers.